The joke that went too far, Elijah's turning point, expanded scene. The dinner was beyond glamorous. It was theatrical. Golden chandeliers dangled like frozen fireworks above tables dressed in snow-white linen. Crystal glasses caught the light and reflected tiny rainbows across the silverware. Waiters in black vests moved in perfect rhythm, placing plates that looked like they'd been painted by artists. Tiny, exquisite portions arranged like edible sculptures. This was the Langston Foundation annual charity gala, held at one of Georgia's most elite country clubs. The kind of event where last names mattered more than first impressions. The guest list read like a Fortune 500 directory. Tech CEOs, real estate moguls, socialites, and the kind of influencers who didn't need to post every moment because everyone already knew who they were. Champagne flowed. Laughter echoed. Deals were being made in whispers between bites of imported truffle risotto. And that's when she said it. A woman in her early 50s, elegantly dressed in a glittering emerald gown, lifted her wine glass and pointed it like a wand across the room. Her voice cut through the music like a crack of thunder. "Hey you." Heads turned. She was addressing a young waiter, standing quietly by the wall, holding a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. "Yeah, the waiter," she said again, slurring just slightly from her third glass of wine. "Why don't you play us a little something on that piano, huh? You look like you've got some rhythm in you." Her lips curled into a smirk. Around her, her table of equally well-dressed friends burst into laughter. Not the kind that welcomes you in, but the kind that pushes you out. The waiter, young, black, clean-shaven, and dressed in a neatly pressed white shirt and black slacks, froze for a moment. He looked at the woman, then at the table, then back toward the polished grand piano in the corner of the room. His name was Elijah Brooks. And while this wasn't the first time someone had made a joke like that, it was the first time it hit him differently. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the mocking laughter. Or maybe it was because tonight he felt something in his chest stir. Something old and deep. Something he'd buried. He could have smiled politely and walked away. He could have reported her to the event manager. He could have even laughed it off like he usually did. But he didn't. Elijah placed his tray down gently on a nearby table and straightened his spine. His hands, steady from years of careful serving, brushed the creases from his shirt. He took a slow breath. And then he walked. Not rushed. Not hesitant. With calm, deliberate steps, he made his way across the ballroom floor. The heels of his polished shoes clicked softly against the marble tile. The room, slowly realizing something unusual was happening, grew quieter with each step he took. People turned their heads. Conversations paused. Even the string quartet that had been playing background music stopped mid-note. All eyes were on him. Elijah reached the grand piano, an ebony Steinway that sat untouched all night, more for decoration than use. He ran his hand lightly across the surface, then pulled out the bench and sat down. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The woman who made the comment leaned in, clearly amused with herself. "Watch this," she whispered. "He'll probably bang out some blues or whatever they listened to on the radio." She chuckled, but Elijah didn't play the blues. His fingers hovered above the keys, not trembling but poised. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elijah wasn't just a waiter. He wasn't just a young man in a white shirt. He was a musician, a master, a former prodigy. And in the next few minutes, he was about to remind everyone in that room exactly what dignity, talent, and grace under pressure really looked like. The woman, Patricia Langston, known as much for her money as for her cutting tongue, leaned back in her velvet chair with the smugness of someone who never expected to be challenged. "Bet he plays some jazz or something," she muttered to her friend beside her, her lip curled in amusement. "This should be good." Laughter rippled through the table, soft and cruel. But at the piano, Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He didn't even blink. His hands floated above the keys like dragonflies over still water. No nerves, no hesitation, just stillness, the kind that comes right before a storm. Then, he played. Not a warm-up, not a casual tinkle of keys. He launched directly into Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And suddenly, the room changed. The haunting opening chords cut through the air like a ghost whisper. Slow, deliberate, and full of emotion deeper than most of the guests had ever felt. Each note seemed to tell a story of pain, of longing, of beauty and darkness. At Patricia's table, forks stopped halfway to mouths. Wine glasses trembled slightly in stunned hands. The smug expressions vanished, replaced by silent awe. Across the ballroom, the hum of clinking glasses and murmured conversations died instantly. Waiters froze mid-step. Even a quartet hired to play background music slowly turned to watch. The only sound now was the echo of Elijah's fingers dancing across ivory keys. But this wasn't just a recital. It was a revelation. Elijah didn't simply play Beethoven. He channeled it. His eyes closed, his brows furrowed. Not in strain, but in emotional immersion. He wasn't performing for the room anymore. He was remembering, reconnecting, healing. When the final chord of the sonata faded, the silence that followed felt sacred. But Elijah wasn't done. Without pausing for applause, without even opening his eyes, he slid seamlessly into a silky, effortless jazz progression. A sound so smooth, it felt like melted gold spilling across the room. Syncopated rhythms, elegant blue notes, and daring improvisation rolled from the piano like it had waited years to be heard. If Beethoven was his soul, jazz was his swagger. People began to lean forward, drawn in. Patrons known for falling asleep during concerts were suddenly wide-eyed, captivated. A famous actor near the back whispered, "Who is this guy?" Elijah still said nothing. His fingers answered every question. And then, just when the room thought it had heard everything, he flipped the mood again. From classical to jazz to soul. The unmistakable intro to Alicia Keys' Fallon emerged, reimagined, slowed down, stripped of its pop gloss, and rebuilt with raw emotion. He played it like a confession, like a secret whispered in the dark. The melody was familiar, but this version? It was his, wounded and proud, fragile and defiant. A woman at the bar wiped a tear from her cheek. A man near the piano recorded silently, hand trembling as he held his phone. No one spoke. No one moved. The music had transformed the room, and every single person in it. As the final note rang out and dissolved into silence, Elijah lifted his hands and rested them on his lap. No bow, no flourish, just stillness. You could have heard a pin drop, and in that silence, a truth echoed louder than any applause. Elijah Brooks wasn't just a waiter. He was an artist, a master, a force. Patricia sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. The woman who had tried to make a joke had just been silenced by the very man she tried to humiliate. And everyone saw it. The applause came slowly at first, a single clap, then another, then a wave of standing ovations, whistles, cheers, and pure, unfiltered awe. But Elijah didn't stay to soak it in. He stood, gave the faintest nod, and quietly walked back toward the kitchen, leaving behind a room forever changed. The silence broke with thunderous applause. Even those who had been barely paying attention, mid-conversation, half-scrolling through their phones, were suddenly on their feet, clapping like they'd just witnessed the final act of a world-class performance. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped back, and all eyes turned toward the man now walking calmly off stage. Elijah stood up from the polished black piano, gave a modest nod, and walked back toward the kitchen like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the kind of moment that made people pause, look around, and whisper to each other in awe. Who is he? Was he part of the show? That wasn't just talent. That was genius. The lounge at Barrow's, a charming southern restaurant tucked into the historic district of Savannah, had never seen anything quite like it. The piano sat mostly untouched, more of a decorative piece than a musical one. Occasionally, a higher musician would come in on weekends, but never anything like this. Never someone like Elijah. Back in the kitchen, the clamor of dishes and the scent of rosemary and garlic faded as the manager came storming through the swinging doors, wide-eyed and breathless. "Elijah, what the hell was that?" he asked, grinning. "Why didn't you tell me you could play like that?" Elijah set down the tray he'd been stacking. Nobody ever asked. The kitchen staff, who had always known Elijah as the quiet, reliable guy who never missed a shift and didn't mind covering when someone called out, just stared. A few of them had peeked through the service window during the performance, jaws slack, frozen mid-task. It was like watching someone peel off a mask to reveal royalty underneath. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elijah had trained for years at Juilliard. He'd played under bright lights and velvet curtains, performed in symphony halls and smoky jazz bars from Brooklyn to the Bronx. He'd once been the rising star that critics couldn't stop writing about, his fingers called fluid as water, and his ear for improvisation described as divine instinct. But all of that was before the call. Before his mother had collapsed in the grocery store aisle back in Augusta. Before the doctor said degenerative and long-term care. Before he packed up his apartment and left the city behind. He hadn't looked back. In Georgia, he took whatever job he could find quickly, waiting tables at Barrows. The money wasn't great, but the hours were steady and the tips added up. It kept the fridge full and the lights on at home. And really, that was all that mattered now. He didn't talk about Juilliard, didn't bring up Carnegie Hall, or the time he'd opened for Wynton Marsalis. It felt like another life. A life paused mid-note. So he wiped tables, filled water glasses, remembered guests' birthdays, and went home tired but grateful. Occasionally, after closing, he'd sit at the restaurants and use piano, play a quiet tune for no one but himself, then lock up and head home. Until tonight. A last-minute cancellation had left the restaurant without its usual weekend entertainment. Someone jokingly suggested Elijah should play. You said you took piano once, right? And with little fanfare, he sat down and let his hands do what they hadn't done for an audience in years. Now, the air was different. Guests were asking for his name. One woman had already offered to book him for her daughter's wedding. The manager was talking about weekly performances. Elijah could already feel something shifting, an old rhythm stirring inside him. But as he washed up and tied his apron back on, he wasn't thinking about fame or stages or what might come next. He was thinking about his mother, waiting at home, and how she used to hum along when he practiced scales as a kid. He smiled to himself. Maybe it wasn't nothing. Maybe it was just the beginning. But someone had filmed it. A guest at Patricia's table, one of the younger ones, barely 20, had recorded the entire performance on their phone. The video began innocently enough. A well-dressed woman gesturing toward the piano and saying, "Go ahead then, if you think you're so talented." Her tone was mocking, dismissive, the kind of syrupy condescension that makes people uncomfortable but is hard to call out directly. Then came Elijah, calm, composed. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and without a word began to play. By the time the video ended, the restaurant had erupted into applause, and Patricia's smug smile had melted into something resembling awe, or maybe shame. The TikTok was posted with the caption, "Rich lady tries to humiliate black waiter. Gets schooled instead, humble legend piano king waiter wins." It exploded overnight. By morning, the video had already surpassed 5 million views. By lunchtime, it had climbed to 10. Within 24 hours, Elijah's name was trending on every major platform. The comments poured in. The poise this man had. He said nothing and still destroyed her. This is why you treat everyone with respect. You never know who you're talking to. Somebody get this man a record deal stat. Can we make Elijah the national vibe for 2025? Who is this king? Viewers from around the world praised Elijah's grace under pressure, his raw talent, and his humility. Musicians, famous ones, began tagging him, asking for collaborations. A renowned jazz label sent a DM. Even Alicia Keys reposted the video with the caption, "This gave me chills. Respect." And just like that, Elijah, who had never even bothered to make an Instagram account before, suddenly had over 500,000 followers. News outlets picked it up next. The headline on Good Morning America read, "From server to stardom. The waiter who silenced a room with a piano." They aired the clip with a split screen, Elijah playing, and Patricia slowly realizing what was happening. The internet replayed that moment like a favorite movie scene, when arrogance met quiet brilliance and lost. Reporters showed up at Barrows, asking to speak to him. Producers called the restaurant, offering interviews, appearances, even record deals. Overnight, Elijah became something of a legend. Not just because of what he could do with a piano, but because of how he handled it, with stillness, strength, and no trace of bitterness. But while Elijah's star was rising, Patricia's was falling, fast. A local socialite and lifestyle influencer, Patricia had built her brand on Southern charm and designer living. She released a statement claiming the whole incident had been taken out of context and that she'd simply been encouraging a talented young man to share his gift. She tried to spin it as a wholesome moment of connection, but the internet wasn't buying it. Clips of her tone, her expression, her patronizing language, it was all there. It wasn't encouragement. It was dismissal, a public attempt to put someone in their place. And it had backfired spectacularly. Sponsors began pulling out. A luxury skincare brand ended their partnership with her effective immediately. A home decor company released a statement distancing themselves from her remarks. Her follower count dropped by tens of thousands. Meanwhile, Elijah just kept showing up to work. When the manager offered to give him the night off after the media frenzy, he politely declined. "I still have tables to serve," he said. But things were already shifting. A team of representatives had reached out to help him navigate the sudden fame. Offers were coming in that could change his life and his mother's. And still, Elijah remained calm, grateful but grounded. He hadn't set out to prove anything. He didn't want revenge or validation. He just wanted to play. Within a week, Elijah was invited to perform on national television. Ellen, The Tonight Show, NPR's Tiny Desk Concert. Each invitation felt surreal, but he met them all with the same quiet humility he'd shown at the piano that night at Barrows. He played with soul and elegance, letting his music speak volumes. He didn't need to explain himself. Each note carried a piece of his story, the years of discipline, the heartbreak of leaving it behind, and the joy of rediscovery. On The Tonight Show, Elijah performed a reimagined medley blending Chopin and Coltrane, drawing a standing ovation and stunned silence from the audience before the applause. Jimmy Fallon called him a once-in-a-generation talent. On Ellen, he was soft-spoken and gracious. He talked about his mother, who was now receiving the best care possible. He didn't mention Patricia by name. He didn't need to. The music was enough. Then came the announcement. Elijah had signed a record deal with a major label, Blue Line Records, known for championing genre-defying artists. His debut album was already in the works. It would be called Unspoken, a mix of classical, jazz, and soul, a tribute to everything he'd lived, lost, and found again. The album cover showed Elijah seated at a grand piano in an empty restaurant dining room, light spilling in from a nearby window, a single napkin tucked in his shirt collar. It was both an homage and a declaration. You can come from anywhere and still belong everywhere. Despite the meteoric rise, Elijah remained grounded. He still lived in the same modest house in Georgia, just with upgraded locks and a better piano. Fame hadn't changed him. It had just caught up to who he already was. In a heartfelt interview with 60 Minutes, the journalist asked him how it all felt. He paused, eyes soft. "Honestly, I'm grateful," he said, "not just for the recognition, but because that moment reminded me who I really am. I forgot for a while. Life has a way of humbling you. But music never left me. It waited." He spoke about his years in New York, the heartbreak of leaving Juilliard behind, the long shifts at Barrows, the loneliness, the fatigue, the quiet nights at the piano when no one was listening. All of it, he said, had shaped the sound people were hearing now. And Patricia, the woman who had tried to mock him, make a spectacle out of his silence. Well, she had become the punchline of her own story. She tried to recover, issuing apologies, hiring a PR firm, even filming a self-reflection video. But none of it rang true. Screenshots of her earlier comments resurfaced. Brands that once flaunted their partnerships with her deleted their content quietly. Speaking engagements were canceled. She lost followers by the thousands. People weren't interested in her redemption arc, because this story wasn't hers. It was Elijah's, a story of quiet power, of a man who never needed revenge, just a piano, of grace under pressure, and the kind of talent that didn't need a spotlight. It created one. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't mock her, even when asked directly. He simply said, "We all make mistakes. I hope she learns from it." And that was that. The internet moved on, but Elijah's star only rose higher. Unspoken debuted at #1 on the jazz charts. Schools began inviting him to speak to students. A scholarship fund was started in his name to support young musicians from underserved communities. And every time he stepped on stage, whether it was a grand concert hall or a quiet community center, he carried with him the same grace, the same humility, the same fire in his fingertips. What started as a moment of casual cruelty became the spark for something beautiful. Elijah's story wasn't just viral. It was timeless.